Good evening. My name is Sam Gralty. I'm the events manager with the Vermont Land Trust, and welcome to Ecology and Conservation of Barn Swallows in New England. Thanks for joining us. If you're not familiar with the Vermont Land Trust, we're a membership organization dedicated to protecting farmland, forest land, and community lands across the state. Since 1977, we've permanently protected over 650,000 acres, which equates to roughly 11% of the state. A few Zoom reminders before we get started. We are recording this, as I mentioned before, but because it's a webinar, you're not going to appear in the recording. If you have questions for our presenter, please use the Q&A feature, which you should see at the bottom of the screen. It also allows you to see other people's questions. So if you have a question as well, you can upvote that by giving it a little thumbs up, and we'll try to emphasize and focus on the questions that have the most interest. So if it's one you want to get answered, give it an upvote. I'd also ask that if you have a question, please don't use the chat feature. Right now the chat is open for everybody, but I'll be shutting it down to just be open for you all to chat with me and Mara. Please only use that if you're having technical issues. Please put all of your questions in the Q&A so we can keep them together and everybody else can see them as well. We will answer as many questions as we can at the end, but we might not get to all of them. But again, I will follow up with some resources. So if there are questions we can answer via follow-up email, I'll do that as well. And yeah, lastly, if you want closed captions enabled, you can click that option at the bottom of the screen as well. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mara Silver. Mara has been studying swallows for over 25 years. She works with various organizations and agencies throughout New England and Canada on swallow conservation projects. She's the founder of Swallow Conservation, a nonprofit organization whose goal is to conserve, protect, and study swallows that breed in North America. She holds a master's degree in wildlife and fisheries conservation from UMass-Amherst, where she researched the characteristics of riverbanks used by nesting bank swallows. And so without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Mara.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm really enjoying looking at this picture of this barn swallow. I don't know if anybody else has noticed it has an insect in its beak. And something I'm going to be talking about tonight is barn swallow natural history, and their insect-eating habit is a huge part of their natural history. Sam was nice enough to make me this introductory slide, and so I'll be talking about the ecology and conservation of barn swallows in New England. Most of my work has been in Massachusetts, but I am certainly, since becoming a nonprofit in 2022, have been expanding my work throughout New England and into Canada and other parts of the country. So can everybody hear me okay, I hope? I'm going to keep talking unless I get notified. What I wanted to start with was just talk about the larger group that swallows are a part of, which are the aerial insectivores. And this slide here provides an example of a species from each group. So in the upper left, you have the barn swallow that I'll be talking about tonight. And then the upper right is a chimney swift. So swifts are another aerial insectivore that we have here in New England. And then there are the nightjars, which are things like nighthawks and whippoorwills, which also catch insects on the wing, as do swallows and swifts. And then we have the flycatchers, which are aerial insectivores that tend to catch their prey from a perch. So that's the group, and I'll talk a little more about it in a bit, but this group is not every species in the group is in decline, but as a group, this group of aerial insectivores is undergoing steep population decline in New England. So now we'll go a little deeper into the 6 species of swallows that we have breeding in New England. So in the upper left is, and some of you may already know these, but I will go over each one, is a cliff swallow, which is another bird that I focus heavily on. Very nests in close proximity with barn swallows in New England. Cliff swallows are more rare, than barn swallows in New England, but they can coexist at the same site. They have different feeding habits and they have different nesting habits. Cliff swallows are the ones that farmers sometimes refer to them as eave swallows, as they nest under the eaves of buildings in New England. And they build these sort of retort-shaped, bottle-shaped mud nests. They're different than barn swallows, which is the middle upper bird, which is barn swallows are kind of the iconic swallow shape, very streamlined with the forked tail. They have their flight, they don't necessarily fly faster than other swallows, but with that long tail, they have extremely good maneuverability and they fly, they can make very tight turns and appear to be going much faster than other swallows. Then in the upper right, you have the tree swallow, which most people are familiar with tree swallows. If you put up bluebird boxes, you'll often get a tree swallow. They will use the same type of box. They're a cavity nester. And they do not excavate their own cavities, so they look for holes to nest in places like marshes where there are dead snags with cavities, and bird boxes have really helped their populations as well. The bottom left is the bank swallow. That's the most diminutive of the swallows that we have in nesting in New England and was the focus of some research I did. They're very colonial. And some people sometimes mix them up with cliff swallows. Cliff swallows are very colonial as well. Bank swallows nest in riverbanks, and you sometimes see them on seacoasts. They excavate burrows into earthen banks. And then in the middle bottom is kind of the, I feel like the swallow that keeps a lower profile is the rough-winged swallow. One of my favorites. I've tried to make all these photographs to the appropriate proportional size. So rough wings are a little bigger than, they're quite a bit bigger than bank. And purple martins, which you can see on the bottom right, are the largest in the swallow martin family that we have nesting here. But rough-winged swallows are also cavity nesters. They are not colonial, and they nest in a lot of strange places. And I have seen them in pipes. I've heard about them nesting in people's tailpipes. They're very opportunistic to a burrow that is already made. And then, of course, on the bottom right, we have the purple martin, which they are here in Massachusetts. They nest pretty much only on the coast. I think in Vermont, you've got them up in the Lake Champlain area. They are kind of a more spotty species to find than the other 6 if you're just traveling around New England. So here we have 2 barn swallows, which I'll be focusing on tonight. These are both males. So again, you can see they're very aerodynamic. They have very short legs, the long wings for that agile flight, and the forked tail. And male and females differ. So the previous photo, I think, was 2 males. This is a male and female side by side, just to show you the males have sort of a buffier orange breast and the females are lighter. They vary, and sometimes it can be hard to tell them apart, but the male also has a longer tail, as you can see in this photo. And they're very beautiful flying. You often see them flying through fields. They're hard to get photographs of. A friend of mine took this photograph, and I always like to include it in my presentations because it's just so unusual to get a shot like that. So barn swallows, as their name indicates, nest in barns. And this is a barn in Quebec. And if you look carefully against the beams, you can see mud cups. And so they construct these cup-shaped nests against beams, usually with a little support underneath. And I wish I was with everyone in person and could point things out a little, but you can see, I hope everyone can see the nests. Barn swallows are not highly colonial, and you can get groups of them nesting in barns such as this one. This one had quite a few pairs nesting in it, but they tend to like they tend to be at least 3 meters apart when they're nesting, or they need to not be able to see each other. So they're not evolutionarily, there's probably not benefits gained from nesting together. They nest together more as a shortage of the kind of habitat they're seeking, if that makes sense. So this is what the nest looks like. It's just beakfuls of mud adhered to the surface of a beam. This is where two rafters come together. They don't like much headspace. It takes about a week to two to build the nest if they start from scratch. They do like to use old nests. The nests are very variable. So here's one with a lot of grass in it. And again, you can see not much headspace, but they do usually like some little footholds they can put their nest, the base of their nest on. And sometimes they have an artistic flair. So this is a nest that I happen to have in my barn this year that I thought was quite interesting, with these few very long strands of grass in it. And they're just quite variable, which is interesting. Sometimes their nests are placed right on a more of a flat surface, as you can see here. So again, some variation in where they place their nests, but generally very close to the ceiling and generally away from predators. So on the middle of a beam or at the top here. So barn swallows arrive in New England in late April and they start nesting in May. And as I said, they're very attracted to old nests and will use old nests, but they also will build nests from scratch if the nests that they return to have parasites left over from the previous year. And they start nesting pretty quickly because they're only here for a few short months as aerial insectivores and relying only on insects for their diet. As soon as it gets cooler here, they've got to get out. So clutch size is usually three to four eggs, sometimes 5. There can be as many as 6. I sometimes get nests of 6, but more commonly 3, 4, 5. And when the young hatch, they're extremely, they're altrical young, which means they're almost just like human babies, very helpless, but they grow very quickly. The parents brood them to keep them warm and feed them quite often on insects that they catch in flight. They create these, they don't catch one insect at a time. They create these, they catch several insects and create this bolus of food that they then feed to the chicks. And the chicks grow fast. So the nest construction period takes about a week to 2, and then they lay the eggs, and the incubation period is about 12 days, and then it takes about 20 days for the chicks to mature and fledge. And so this is a nest of chicks at kind of a silly looking stage here. But they get cute. And these are barn swallows in my barn that these are juveniles getting ready to fledge. What's interesting about them is once they're about 12 days old, they start to defecate over the side of the nest. Before that period, the parents carry what are like fecal sacks. They're very, it's almost like a bird diaper. They can just carry this little sack of waste out, and but when the chicks get to be a certain age, they go over the edge, and that's when people get upset about the droppings on the floor, and we'll talk about that later. So barn swallows are a very widely distributed species. So there are 6 subspecies. In this map here, you can see the reddish orange is where they breed, and the blue is where they winter, and the yellow is migration areas, and the purple is year-round. So our swallows here in North America travel a very long distance to South America and Central America to winter. So very, very wide distribution again with six, some even think there are seven subspecies. What's really interesting about the subspecies is they look very different and behave very differently, but they're genetically very similar. And there's a group in Colorado doing a lot of work on their genomics. And this is some of their work. So this is the six subspecies. And what's interesting too about swallows is that it looks like they have been nesting alongside humans for millennia. I get a lot of questions from both just casual birders, but even scientists sort of wanting to discuss the idea of, well, where were barn swallows before there were barns? Aren't they, if they're declining, aren't they reverting back to their natural population levels or whatever normal population levels? And I think what's interesting to note about barn swallows is that according to some of this more recent genomic data, barn swallows, if you look at their genetics, it looks like there was what was called a founder effect, where when humans spread across the landscape from North Africa, from the Fertile Crescent, about 11,000 years ago, the swallows followed along with them, using their human habitations as nesting sites. Now, this is just one study, but it's a theory and it's quite interesting. The other argument I have against sort of letting them just decline to their natural sites is, if anybody has ever seen a barn swallow in a natural cave, I'd like you to put that in the chat, because I never have, and I've been looking at barn swallows for 35 years. And also, barn swallows, if we've supplied them all this habitat and they're declining, and now we're seeing habitat that's going empty, like perfectly good habitat. People tell me all the time, I have a barn. I used to have 20 pairs of barn swallows. Now I only have 5. Nothing's changed. Well, something else is affecting populations aside from habitat. So we need to do what we can to conserve them while we figure out what is going on with them and causing the decline. People, just to sort of back up that sort of history with humans, they're in ancient art from the Bronze Age. So this is a depiction of a swallow from Greece, from the Bronze Age. And these are old Egyptian representations of swallows. Any Victorian postcard you see has a swallow. They're very, they're dear to people. And I think people have the impression that they'll always be here and that they're here. And what's honestly happening is they're declining, and not just in North America, but in many other parts of their range worldwide. So here's this is the interior of Akiva in New Mexico, and I can just picture barn swallows nesting in there. I don't know, I have no evidence that they did, but there is documentation of them nesting along indigenous people's dwellings in North America, but they have been doing it for millennia. Of course, in New England, when we settlers cleared the land and started building, started the great era of farming in the 1700s and 1800s, populations grew here and expanded greatly. And this is sort of the era when the barn swallow was starting to have even more of a heyday. So a barn like this is perfect habitat for a barn swallow. So when you see in New England farms with barns and open fields, horse barns, for some reason, barn swallows love horse barns. I always see the densest populations of barn swallows in horse barns in my travels. and then open fields for foraging. These are fields adjacent to my my barn swallow barn, and the barn swallows just swoop over the driveway there into the meadow and forage and come back and feed their young. So they need a barn in which to place their nest and open areas for foraging. And they also thrive well with livestock. Smaller scale farming seems to benefit barn swallows. And it may be that there's more insects created by having the farm animals around. The temperatures in the barn may be more stable, but barn swallows do well on active farms, small scale active farms. The problem is that barn swallows are now declining so steeply. I mean, they've been declining since the 60s, and in the 80s, the decline became even steeper, became very steep. And a lot of the reason for that is changes in the landscape. I'm just going to show you, this is Massachusetts. So sorry, I'm Massachusetts based, but we have a Mass Audubon here did a breeding bird survey. I mean, a breeding bird atlas. And this data is from 1974 to 1979. And what this shows is any block that's dark green has confirmed breeding barn swallows were sighted. The lighter green is possible. The lightest green, I mean, probable is the medium green, lighter green is possible, and white is not found. So there was a really good, even in the 70s, they were hanging on, doing pretty well. And then the next breeding bird atlas, which is now also old data, this is 2007 to 2011, this survey took place. You can see there's still good coverage, but there's just so much less confirmed breeding. And this trend has just continued. This is Vermont. This is from the Vermont Breeding Bird Atlas, just to kind of illustrate that Vermont is really no different. Barn swallows are declining in Vermont. Not to go back a million, but I guess I wanted to just show you that this illustrates that the decline is steeper the further north you go and the further east you go. And barn swallows are listed in Canada. They were listed as threatened. They're now special concern because there's been some increases in numbers in the western part of the country, but they're also listed in several provinces, and people are very surprised to learn that. So this is sort of like what declining habitat looks like for barn swallows, and it doesn't mean it's bad per se. This is better for some warblers, the regrowth of the forest. This is the exact same location in Petersham, Mass. But you can see on the left that it's sort of a barn swallow paradise there, and that same spot now is regrown with forests, and so it's not useful for barn swallows. Another issue is just the decline of agriculture in New England. So this is a barn that I worked at for a long time on cliff swallows and barn swallows. And you can see the open windows at the peak of the roof. And I was focused on the cliff swallows and I wasn't really paying attention to the barn swallows, but I didn't realize how much I enjoyed them. They're so cheerful. And this barn, it was Mass Audubon property, and in the deed, it was written in that I could maintain the cliff swallow colony with some of the management activities I was doing, but it said nothing about barn swallows. And all of a sudden they fixed up the barn, and I literally saw barn swallows trying to get in this barn. This was in 2010, and it was such a disappointment. I realized, oh God, I got to think about barn swallows. What is going on with barn swallows, not just cliff swallows, which I had been studying. So yes, the decline of agriculture. This is a barn that once had barn swallows nesting in it, and near me, that just fell down. And then suburbanization. So farm fields like this just being turned into, and people need places to live. I understand that, but it just makes for degraded habitat for barn swallows when a site like this that used to have one farmhouse and, livestock and farming activities is turned into more of a subdivision. And then we also are losing wetlands, and we have been for a long time. And the issue, wetlands are so important to swallows, and I don't think some of us realize, again, as aerial insectivores, the water bodies are so important at the beginning of the nesting season. Every year when the barn swallows return in late April, they're anxious to get nesting, and then we might have some cold weather, and it never fails. They're always down at a marsh about a mile from my barn, feeding right over the water. So when it gets cold, they feed over water. So they rely on water bodies for when the weather gets, and other swallows, it's the same thing for other swallows. They rely on, and even small water bodies are quite important, can be quite important. And then just agricultural intensification. So I'm just looking at my time, making sure I'm okay. Just turning, these monocultures with chemicals just create very poor habitat for barn swallows because it reduces the diversity and number of insects. And other reasons for declines, we don't really know. We don't have a lot of data. So why are aerial insectivores declining? And there's a lot of, we have a lot of guesses, but it's hard to know for sure. But the one common feature they all share is that they feed on insects. And we just don't have a lot of data on insect populations. And nature is complex, and are there fewer insects? Are there lower quality insects? There's some work being done in Canada showing that young barn swallows are fledging just as many young as they always have, but they don't seem to be as in good body condition. There's not as many returns. So it's really hard to figure out exactly what's going on with insects. We need more studies on insects in North America, insect populations. A lot of people tell me, oh, I don't see insects on my windshield. Back in the summer in the 70s, your windshield would be covered with insects when you went for a drive, especially at night. And I'm old enough to know about that too and remember it. So, that could be part of what's going on. And we're just using too many chemicals. It's barn swallows, sometimes I know that pesticides have a use, but the sort of just widespread everywhere using of them without kind of thinking about what some of the costs might be down the road isn't good. And I mean, barn swallows probably aren't affected by the lawn chemicals on this lawn, but what happens is the chemicals leach into the water and can affect the larval stages of the insects that swallows feed on. And some work being done in Canada has shown that, in fact, neonicotinoids, which are widely used in the US, a plant only takes up about 10% of that, the chemical. The rest gets washed away into the ground and into the water, and suppresses the hatch of insects that, in the case of tree swallows, they rely on these essential fatty acids that come out that they catch in these ephemeral insects that hatch early in the spring. There's a woman in Canada who's doing amazing work on that, studying that very issue. So, there are a lot of subtle things going on that are affecting these birds that we might not even know about or know how to think about. Here again, I was talking about the pesticides and the intense agriculture and the overuse of all of these chemicals. So here again, this is the pink line is the aerial insectivores. And you can see this is a little out. This is, I think, 2012, so it's a little outdated, but you can just see the aerial insectivore line going down. So I'm going to talk about happier things now. That was the little depressing part. So this barn again was where I did a lot of my work on cliff swallows, and where I first started getting interested in barn swallows. I could give a whole nother talk on cliff swallows, which are really my passion, but barn swallows are creeping up and taking over a little bit. They can't, but they sort of are. So at this barn, as I had mentioned, I had been noticing barn swallows, but not paying attention to them. Just I was really working on the cliff swallow colony and trying to figure out why it was declining. And then I was no longer allowed to come to this barn anymore because I started speaking out a little too much about the swallows, which is one of my problems. So I didn't do anything bad. It just was like Mass-Audubon just decided to have somebody else do the management stuff I was doing, and there are no swallows there anymore. Anyway, nothing against Mass-Audubon. But I did remember that my parents had this barn. So my parents bought a barn in Shelburne, Massachusetts with several other families in the 60s. And I never had paid much attention to the barn because it was like my parents' barn. And all they did was throw a bunch of junk in it. They weren't farmers. They were from New York City. They just wanted to get out of the city, and they bought this barn. And I do remember barn swallows in it when I was a kid. But I thought, well, I have nothing. I don't have my pilot study site anymore. So I am going to go up to Shelburne and just let the barn swallows into that barn. So the first thing I did was open windows. I opened the top windows at first. This is the barn from the road. It's really a beautiful property. I still own the barn. I don't own the house anymore. And I decided to start monitoring barn swallows at my barn. And that was in 2011 when I could no longer go to the other barn in the previous picture. So there was one pair of barn swallows in 2011 nesting in this horse barn, which you can see the opening to. So I decided to just recreate what I had done at Graves Farm, the farm you saw before, which was create a mud source. I thought, well, okay, what do barn swallows need? This isn't an active farm. I'm going to create a mud source because farms have mud. So I have right in the barnyard, I created this, I used lake liner, and I created this mud puddle. And I actually was lucky, there's a cistern up there, and I was able to hook up water and have a water source. Not everybody has this, but there's my mud puddle. And the barn swallows paid attention to it. So there's a barn swallow. This is actually from a video. And in 2012, I also opened up if you can see the windows, these are the lower level is the stanchions. I actually ended up closing the upper portion of the barn, and I'll explain later why, and giving the swallows access to the stanchion area, which is still very huge. So I went up to 3 pairs from 1 pair from 2011 to 2012. And then I'm compressing 2013 onward because what I've done at this barn is just continue to, well, play music for them. So for a while I was playing their calls, and then I realized that because they're not highly colonial, it would attract them and then they'd get sort of agitated by it. So that's something I do once in a while, but it's better. It's more useful in the case of cliff swallows, which are highly colonial. So there's my mud puddle. And then I started making clay nests. So I had made clay nests for cliff swallows, which are the bottle-shaped ones you see. And I thought, well, I'll make nests for barn swallows since they like to reuse old nests. So the little cup-shaped ones you see are barn swallow nests. I did do ceramics in college. I studied ceramics as an undergrad and science, and then I did science for my master's. So I do have some experience with ceramics. So it was kind of fun for me. And then I got them fired. So this is the crazy kiln, the crazy place I get my stuff fired. That's a big mess. Um, but you can see all the nests after they're fired. They're bisqueware, which is like dishes without glazing, and they're breathable. They're perfect for the nests because they're breathable and yet they will not crumble if wet. And I could make them look like a barn swallow nest. So I have two little holes and screws and gaskets, and I just started screwing them up in the barn close, taking the lead of the swallows and putting them in places that the swallows like to nest. And they like to add to them. So this is what I started seeing was barn swallows finding the nests, singing on them, attracting a mate, and then finishing them off. And there, I wish I was a better photographer, but you can see some beaks in there. So this is one of the nests I made that the barn swallows used. And so for the next, I'm still doing it. Since then, what I've been doing is keeping the barn open, and I've been putting up these nests. I keep the mud puddle going, and sometimes most all the swallows in my barn use the nests I make, but sometimes they build their own nests. And you can see the population has gone up. So in spite of all of this horrible stuff I've been telling you, by making some improvements at the nesting site level, I was able to positively affect this colony. Now, I know more experimentation needs to be done, and I say it was simple, and maybe that's because I enjoy it, but I really do think it was quite simple, some of the things I did. And I share my nests with people, so nobody has to make them who knows me. So it's been a slow but steady increase. And I think what's nice about this is that we hear so much bad information, like the information I was telling you about climate change affecting insect populations, pesticide use, neonicotinoids. And really the only tangible thing we can do on the ground is try to help them while they're here nesting. And that to see that I could have a positive impact at my barn has made me quite happy. I don't have my 2025 data. I went down to 10 pairs. So I've gone up and up and up, but we had a very cold late May, and I think that affected a lot of swallows in my area. I know it did because I could see it. I could see some mortality, but still, I had 10 pairs in 2025. And so what I'm doing now that I've created my nonprofit, is try to branch out and help people in new locations who want to help swallows. So this nest is up in a barn in Conway. There was a woman in Conway. You can see the horsehair in her nest. This isn't a horse barn. She said, I can't stand it. The barn swallows come every year, but they never nest. I want them. I want them. These are the kind of people I like to hear from. And so we put a couple nests up in her barn, and it took a couple years, but now she has them and they come back every year. And she doesn't have to create a mud source because she has horses, but she did play calls for a little while, and she put up a few of these nests. And that's one of her pictures. And then I do other things like, so this is a woman called me from Coleraine, which is a town next to me, and she had barn swallows nesting on a light bulb on her porch, and every time she walked outside, they'd freak out, and but she loved them, and she just wanted to try to get them in her barn. And I looked at her barn, and I found an old cliff swallow nest, but she didn't have any cliff swallows nesting in there. So we did this whole project where we created like a false ceiling. So I sent her this picture you're seeing, with like an idea of a design of like, let's lay some more boards there on those rafters and create like a ceiling and then place some nests close to the ceiling. Now, they haven't used this yet, but we just started trying. But these are the kinds of things I'm doing. This is actually this was one of my favorite calls this year, was from the Army Corps of Engineer. And this is something I sent my contact there. You can see the barn swallow nest under this dock. And I was just trying to figure out how many inches tall that area was, because he wants to place artificial nests all along the dock. So this was my idea I sent him. If you see the boat, the problem that he was having was that barn swallows were building on the boat in early spring, and then they had to take the boats out. And it's just so nice when people reach out and he was upset about it. And he was like, I want to keep them from nesting on the boat and get them to nest under the dock if I can. Now, one thing that I do have to tell people is, like, I can't move swallows. Like, we're going to try this. They're already nesting under the dock. Let's try it. But I do often get people getting in touch with me and saying, I have barn swallows. They're just, pooping all over the floor and I want to move them. And that you really can't move them with nests. That's not what I do. Here's one more example, just because I think it's fun to see people get in touch and they're like, barn swallows are trying to nest. This woman, she's like, they're trying to nest, but there's really nowhere for them to go. And they start building and then they leave. So she put up some boards and put some nests inside. And it's just, these are the kinds of things I do now. I have noticed some new challenges. So putting up nests, creating mud sources, opening buildings, public education is great, but natural systems are dynamic, and I keep seeing new things because I have been doing this for decades now. And what I'm noticing with barn swallows is a lot more issues with parasites. And I'm sorry to show you these awful pictures. And some sites have problems with parasites and some don't. Some years are worse than others, but I've even started trying to develop ways of tackling parasites, which in swallows, because they are declining. In some ways, I wonder about that, because I know there's some studies being done in Nebraska showing that cliff swallows are actually building up resistance to parasites. If anyone's interested, I can send you that literature. And that's happened over the last 40 years. But it's really hard when you're sort of curating your barn swallow colony to see these chicks covered with mites and just moribund. The mites suck their blood and not do anything, or be covered in blowflies. So there's the slide. I have a rehabber. I have my rehabber certificate, so I can play with the birds. So I actually have a method for cleaning the mites off the birds. And what I like about my clay nests is that I can take them down and clean them out and put fresh bedding in them. And that gets rid of a lot of the mites. A lot of the mites are in the nesting material. So the nest can be good for controlling parasites if you're being obsessive like I am. Another issue I've noticed more recently, and as I've gotten more involved with the barn swallow conservation and visiting more sites, is that with the hotter summers we're having and the fact that barn swallows like to nest close to the ceiling, in barns with metal roofs, they can overheat. And if they overheat, the chicks will literally just jump out before they're ready. So I've been trying to, in some cases, I have a lot to learn about thermodynamics and construction. That's not my forte. But well, this is a nice example of someone who just lowered her barn swallows into a basket because they were bailing out of the nest they were in. I don't necessarily recommend that. But this was in Georgia, and she happened to send me a picture, and I thought it was so cute. And the parents were feeding them in the basket. But this just also illustrates that the metal roof was overheating the chicks. And then they jump out and they're too small. And it's like, what do you do with this bird? You know, the parents are looking for it. It's like 100 degrees. So I've been testing out some other ways of dealing with heat. One has been to try to put styrofoam over styrofoam panels above nests. I have not found that to work as well as, this is not a very clear picture, but what under this metal roof, there's a nest directly under the what looks like just garbage on the roof, but that's foam with a foil. It's insulation that has foil on the outside, and it's about 2 inches thick. And I laid it over the nest. It covers about 2.5 yards, and it made an extremely big difference. The chicks were gasping in there. And I actually talked to somebody who does solar energy stuff, and he said, try this. And we secured it with a chain, and it really lowered the temperature above that nest. Again, these things are not practical for every person to climb on roofs, but it's good to know about these issues that barn swallows are facing and some of the little things that I've found that have helped if it's possible for others to do so. Another funny thing about barn swallows. So this structure here that has the overheated chicks, there are more barn swallows in it, and it's little than this whole barn. So barn swallow nest site selection is completely bizarre for me to understand. Bigger barns generally tend to have bigger colonies, but sometimes barn swallows like a certain type of building and are in great concentrations there. So this is one of my favorite farms. This barn here has cliff swallows, barn swallows, chimney swifts, and big brown bats. So this is quite a treasure. And the people who own it, just as important, love all of them and let me run around there all I want. So other factors to consider with barn swallows, they do produce droppings. And this is what you get after one brood. Barn swallows will raise 2 broods, oftentimes, not always, but they are double brooded generally. They don't always use the same nest. But, I didn't do anything about it, but you could place a piece of newspaper down to catch these droppings. Shoe is for scale. That's a size 7. I feel like it's not a lot. Now, obviously, if you're using a space for events or you're going to have a wedding, that wouldn't work. But when you can let them in. There are ways to deal with these droppings. They don't smell nearly as bad as dog droppings or cat droppings. In fact, they don't smell at all. Another thing I wanted to mention is that a lot of people get in touch with me about creating alternative structures for barn swallows because barns are coming down, or people are repurposing them and don't want the swallows in them. And this just says it all. So a big barn does not equal a kiosk. So in Canada, where the barn swallow was listed, these kiosk structures a lot of information was put out about them. A lot of them were put out on the landscape, and there was very little follow-up. And when there was follow-up, they found very few using them. Now, I'd say if you had something like 2 pair in your garage and you decide you just can't have them in the garage for some reason, a kiosk might be okay. But for something like the barn you see on the left, to think you could put, 15, 20 pair in a structure that size, I have yet to see it. They're just not that colonial. There's other things about the larger buildings that may be very important to barn swallows, like more thermal temperatures. Um, some research has also shown that members of a pair do not both sleep on the nest. Sometimes a barn swallow might be across the other side of the barn. When the young fledge, another thing I've noticed about these structures that I think is not very helpful, when young fledge, they hang out in a barn or a structure that they've been born in for a few days before they fly out. And there's absolutely nothing to perch on here. I mean, there's a tree, but barn swallows have not, these structures need more testing. Now, one person, I have a friend who I met through barn swallows, and he built a structure that is the design that has been most successful to date. And it hosted, not his, but the one that he modeled his after, hosted 5 to 7 pairs at most. But that's the only one I know of that has had more than just a few, that design. And there's no follow-up on the one that it was in Townsend, Ontario. There was no follow-up on how they'd fared through time. I mean, some of these old barns have had colonies that have been there for decades. So, but I really commend this person, Glenn, and he just sent me an email and said he created a mud puddle. So, and put up a perch. So he's very into it. And this is at a site where there's no barn. So this is in a park where a barn that had barn swallows nesting in it had been taken down in the 80s. And Glenn saw swallows still flying around the area and decided to create this. And that's what I think, where I think these have utility. I just don't think we can say, I'm going to put this up and it will replace, you know, my gigantic dairy barn with 30 pairs of barn swallows, and it just hasn't happened. So other things you can expect is sometimes phoebes like to use my cups, the cups, if you put up cups, that's what I've noticed is sometimes phoebes use them, sometimes house finches use them. I don't mind phoebes using them at all. I love phoebes. Another thing, if you open up your barn for barn swallows, they tend to, if you open up a lower floor and they have access to the upper floor and the windows are not open on the upper floor, they can get trapped. So they can get very used to going in and out of certain spaces. But if they're going up and up and up and they can't get up from the top floor, I have seen them trapped, and that is not something you want to do. So make sure you keep windows open on upper floors from where you're letting them in. Now we're just going to look at cute pictures of juvenile barn swallows. So sometimes this guy actually, so these are other things I run into. Sometimes this guy wasn't flying. I couldn't figure out what was going on. And if you look at the foot, he had a spider web all around the bottom on his foot. And he was, I think, tangled in a little bit of spider web. So of course I caught him and untangled him. Cute little thing, or her. So you never know what you're going to see. Another thing, if you've got barn swallows, if you're not in the barn you're monitoring a lot, they get very used to activity. When it's regular, they get desensitized. But if it's infrequent, the parents freak out. And once the chicks reach 14 days, if the parents freak out and you're standing close to the nest and they just get to a certain level of fear, they fly out before they're ready. I've done that. It's the worst thing. They're not ready, but it's their response is to fly out. I have a method for making them stay back in that I can share, but it's best just not to approach nests after day 14. That's one of my major points tonight. So this is my barn again. This is just sort of ideal barn swallow habitat, just to leave you with sort of what, again, sometimes people want barn swallows, but they're in the forest and it's like, nope, they need foraging areas, they need a shelter, and they need mud. So this is my plea. I see we're almost towards 8. this is sort of what I like to help people with, if they can give barn swallows access to a barn if they have one, or if they know of one, talk to people who may own it or manage it. I make nests and sell them. I have a sliding scale for people who want them. And don't we all love barn swallows? This is the goal. So you talk to farmers and they say, oh, back in the day, there were hundreds of them on the wires. And we're not seeing that anymore, And so this is kind of like makes me very happy. The season of monitoring and watching is fun, but it's always fun when everybody fledges and you can see that the population has grown. So this is my website. It's Swallow Conservation. You can learn a lot about barn swallows, cliff swallows, and bank swallows at my website. And you can see pictures of the nests. You can get in touch with me. I am happy to help anyone who wants to help barn swallows, cliff swallows, answer questions. If there's something I missed tonight, please get in touch. And thank you all for joining me tonight. I think that's it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We do have some time for some quick questions. I'll try to go through some. There's some that were somewhat answered, but one to start with. What's the ideal location for the mud? Is it as close to the barn as possible? I'm guessing, or?
Yeah, so with if you think about barn swallows, they're really like you most often see them collecting mud in a barnyard, or it can be, and it doesn't have to be a fancy mud puddle like mine. I often see them in muddy tire tracks in a driveway. What you don't want is, I sometimes have people saying, well, we've got a marsh down the hill and there's mud down there. Barn swallows don't collect mud among high vegetation. So it's better the closer the better, and short vegetation around the mud source. And like I said, my mud puddle might have looked a little intimidating. I do believe they're attracted to mud, and that's why I made it so big. If you already have swallows and you're trying to enhance the population, just widen out. Some people just, if they have clay soil, will just spray down their driveway. But yeah, you want the soil to be not too sandy in that case.
Gotcha.
I add clay to my puddle.
Nice. Do you know if like the pairs come back and use the same nests year after year? I know you said sometimes after one brood they'll switch to a different nest. Are there studies about if the same pairs come to the same sites year after year?
So adult barn swallows are very faithful to their nesting sites, not always the nest. It depends because, like I said, they do get parasites, and sometimes they assess the parasite load. And I actually don't know. I have to research more about how well parasites survive over the winter, like mites. Blowflies, you don't have to worry about in that case, but like mites and fleas, I'm not sure. But I know in my barn, well, I put up nests, so I kind of like, they tend to go to those because it's like, oh, there's one there. But I do have to say, there are some sites where they always build them. And I don't know if it's the same pair because I don't band, but I can tell you that adult barn swallows are very faithful they'll come back to the same nesting site. I just don't know if it's the same nest.
Gotcha. There's another question about temperature. Is there an ideal temperature for the chicks?
I don't know. Quite honestly, the parents really take care of that. So if the chicks are born and the weather cools off, they brood them. So one or the other will just sit tight on them until the weather improves. So, when it gets to be wet and rainy in the 50s, it can get rough for swallows. You don't want that. And the chicks need to be fed, so there need to be flying insects. But I don't know what the ideal temperature is, but the parents are very good at brooding and protecting their chicks as long as they can without starving, but that's what happened in May this past year, was that luckily there were no chicks at that point, but the parents couldn't find enough food for themselves. So, yeah.
Let's just do a couple more. Somebody asked about an overhang outside of a garage being a good space or a decent space. I'm guessing ideally it would be fully enclosed. You showed some of those other examples that were less than ideal.
It depends. I mean, I never say never. I find them often on porches. So that's a little more kind of an enclosed spot. I know Cornell Lab of Ornithology advertises these kind of nest box things that you can put up. And I've never seen them use that. And I think I talked to someone there and they said that they are meant more for porches. I don't know if the eave were large enough, I think it would be fine. I have seen barn swallows nest under eaves, but I think it's the exception, like not the rule.
Gotcha. And then maybe the last question, just asking about the food source, if there's a good food source, I'm assuming near your barn. That last photo showed kind of how it's adjacent to that field. I'm guessing that's where they are often most often seen feeding in that field. Is that right?
They go and feed down that way. They also go, there's a beaver pond to the west. That was east to the west. So when it's cooler, I see them over at the beaver pond. I don't have livestock. I know that I think that from what I've read, that really increases the density of insects on a farm. It's also a really windy mountaintop, so it's pretty impressive how they do up there. I know that I've done some reading, and I know that barn swallows will tend to feed in fields, but along hedgerows where insects will congregate in the wind, or but they seem to know how to find them.
Awesome. Great. Well, I guess the last thing I'll call out, there's more of a comment in here about Helen Wybrow's book, The Salt Stones, which I recently read, which is a great book and has a good section about barn swallows in there. So if you haven't read that book, I highly recommend it.
Okay, I haven't read it.
But yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much. Just to let everybody know, we do have some more events coming up. There's some that are going to be announced soon, but if you're interested, definitely go to vlt.org/events to find out more. We have some webinars and some in-person events coming up. And yeah, thank you all so much for attending. If you donated when you got your ticket, thank you so much. If you would be willing to support our work at events like this, that would be great. You can head to vlt.org/donate to make a donation. And thank you all so much for coming. And Mara, thank you so much for sharing all of this excellent information with us tonight.
Thanks everybody for coming.
All right. Thanks, everybody.